Titled Political Postcards from the Island of Ireland. Thank you very much indeed.
Excellent. No pressure, Brett. How to follow that introduction? I didn't know that you knew some of those things about me. So thank you. I do have some notes because this is the first time I've given this presentation, so I don't want to miss anything. The views that I have tonight are very much my own personal views. They don't they're not associated with any organisation that I'm involved with or worked with, and some of those are really just my interpretation of what I've discovered over the years. I have brought a number with me. I'll set them out on the tables afterwards. I have a number of them up on the screen that you'll be able to see at them when I'm talking about them. So what I want to cover tonight is very much give you an introduction on postcards, because what are they? I want to talk a little bit about the Irish problem. You know, what was the Irish problem? What was it referred to? And why does it feature on postcards? One of the things that I found out is actually the 1907 Belfast strike was actually quite an important time in politics in Northern Ireland. And there's actually a number of postcards were published at that time, and they tell the story of what actually happened. And for me, it was a real precursor to the troubles that took place in Belfast. That led us on to Home Rule. So again, it features on postcards. That then in turn led on to the 1916 Easter Rising. And I'll stop sort of about 1922 with the formation of Ireland and Northern Ireland. But to end the talk, I'll give some modern postcards from what we call the 1970s, 1980s, because they tell a little bit of story as well. The Brett mentioned there about philately. Delatology is actually the official name for postcard collecting. And it's thought that it's one of the 3 largest hobbies in the world, along with coin and stamp collecting. And as I was saying to Declan earlier on, when I was asking him how long do I need to talk for, and he said anything less than 3 hours just isn't acceptable. So I'll try and get through it as quickly as I can. But stamp collecting really was philately, and philately really deals from the introduction of the stamps, which started in 1840 with the introduction of the penny black. But my interest in philately is more the history period before that and how the mail travelled and what way it was moved around the country. And that's really what got me interested into the roads, because the road network developed over that. But delatology is the term that we use for postcard collecting. And really, what is a postcard? It's really a small, thin piece of cardboard intended for writing and mailing without an envelope. Now, why is that important? Way back in times around about 1820, for example, you paid for a letter depending on how far it travelled and how much it weighed. So the piece of paper was folded up inside itself. The letter was written and the address was put on the outside. It was posted, and when it was delivered, the postman knocked your door and said, "Declan, I've got a letter for you. It's going to be 2 shillings and 6pence," which in 1820 was a lot of money. And if that had come from London to Ireland, that's what it would have cost in those days. So the postcard was developed as a way of having a little piece of card with something on one side and you wrote your message on the other. And that was introduced at a time when we had a uniform penny post system, but the postcard was posted for a halfpenny. So you could send your letter anywhere in these islands for a halfpenny, which was a massive change from the 2 shillings and 6pence that it would have cost before that. The idea for the postcard really originated in Germany in 1865. It was the Austrian government, however, in 1869, who issued the very first postal card, and this is a picture of what that looked like. The early postcard had its critics. Many people thought that it was improper to mail messages and cards that people could see. For me, I actually love it because I can see some of the social history aspects that people were talking about, because quite a lot of the postcards that you will get now still have those messages on the back. History itself can really be tracked on these postcards, and they feature lots of different things like historical buildings, famous people, major events, art, holiday scenes. You'd maybe remember back into the 60s and 70s, people were sending these funny, humorous cards back and forward from their holidays. And really, that was the way that we communicated before there was real growth in telecoms and electronic communications. So how do we define the Irish problem? 1844, the future British Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, defined what he called the Irish question. And he said, a dense population in extreme distress inhabit an island where there is an established church, which is not their church, and a territory aristocracy, the richest of whom live in foreign capitals. And that was what Disraeli said way back in 1844. So he was trying to set the scene. But it goes back further than that. Way back in 1778, the Whig Party was founded in Ireland, and soon it became an alliance of radicals, reform-minded parliamentarians, and dissident representatives of the governing class, is the way one critic described them. And by 1791, this alliance was already fracturing, and several rival Whig clubs had been set up by people such as Napier Tandy in Dublin and Belfast. And this card here depicts the scene of the House of Commons during the independence period of 1782 to 1800, and that was published around about the late 1860s, 1870s. And again, I brought some of these examples along with you just to let you see them. So at relevant times, I'll put those out and refer to some of them. So what happened after that? 1780, there was an Irish Patriot Party led by Henry Grattan, and he campaigned for reforming the Irish Parliament. And he campaigned for lessening of British interference in Irish affairs, is the way he described it. And he was very much supporting the Irish volunteer movements. Important to remember at that time that Irish volunteer movement was actually widespread Protestant support. It wasn't the Catholics, it was very much the Protestant side. Back to the postcards. This one here dates back to show an image of 1780. And it's the Irish Patriot Party, as it was referred to then, led by Henry Grattan. And sorry, this one here, 1782 was the first corps of volunteers was formed in Belfast around that time. And the movement spread very rapidly across Ireland. By that period in 1782, there were 40,000 people had enlisted as volunteers in that party. And more than half of them were actually based in the province of Ulster. It was then strongly influenced by American ideas. Though loyal to the Crown, the volunteers demanded greater legislative freedom for the Dublin Parliament. So this was the Protestant landowners saying back to London, we actually want to have more control over our decisions that are being made in Ireland. The decades or so before the Third Home Rule crisis of 1912 may therefore appear comparatively dull in comparison to this, and very unimportant when compared to the political storm that took place in the following years. However, the events taking place within that decade had a real bearing on what happened over our future years. And some of those events were actually recorded on the postcards. So let's go forward to some of the postcards. This series here shows some images of King Edward VII coming into Belfast. I think it was his first visit actually into Dublin was around about 1905. These date 1903 were visits into Belfast. Now at that time, under pressure from both government, a group called the United Irish League, a national political party, and the Irish Parliamentary Party, or as they were called, the Irish Home Rule Party UK, as they were called. A gentleman called George Wyndham, who was the Chief Secretary of Ireland, gave his backing to a land conference to take place in December 1902. Now that land conference was attended by a gentleman called John Redmond, whom we've heard of in Irish history, another gentleman called Russell, who spoke for the Ulster tenant farmers, and they were led by their own representative, a gentleman called William O'Brien. And the landlords at that time at that conference were represented by Lord Dunraven. Now the outcome of that was that they worked out a scheme for tenant land prices, with the government making up the difference between the price offered by the tenants and that demanded by the landlords. And that became known as the Wyndham Act. Now it was shortly after that act came into place in 1903 that King Edward VII thought that it was then appropriate, with that act in place, he thought it was appropriate to make a visit to Northern Ireland, very much keeping that royal presence at the forefront for everybody on the island of Ireland. So we were seeing at that stage lots of political issues coming forward. So fast forward a couple of years, a series of postcards were issued for the Irish exhibition in 1907. Now, that exhibition was really intended to improve the trade of Irish goods. The leading force behind that was a gentleman called William Martin Murphy, and he was a businessman, but he was also the owner of the Irish Independent and Cleary's department store, the Dublin United Transport Company, and several other Irish overseas ventures. So he had a real vested interest in trying to promote Irish business. So his paper, the Republic, which he had published in Belfast, they saw the exhibition in economic and political terms as detrimental to Irish interests. And one of the phrases that I quoted from that on the screen is, they called upon all Irish people in Ireland and abroad to abstain from supporting the said exhibition. So in 1907, there was a bit of friction between the different areas as to what was taking place. But we see again, during the opposition, King Edward VII considered it significantly important to merit another royal visit, and during which he was originally intended that he should conduct an investiture for the Order of St. Patrick using the Irish crown jewels. However, historians might well remember that those crown jewels were stolen from Dublin Castle on July the 6th, 1907, and they never actually made it to the exhibition. And ironically, even today, they've never been recovered. So that was one of the downfalls as to what happened at that exhibition. And that's another postcard just showing an image of the King and Queen coming into the exhibition. 1907. What happened in 1907? I must have missed a bit of my notes. Gallagher's cigarette factory in Belfast was one of the big employers. They employed over thousands of people, and they actually sent 2,000 of their staff down to the exhibition in 1907. Came down on the train and they visited the exhibition. So some of the employers in Belfast were very willing to support that and use that as an outing for their staff. But 1907, what else was happening before that exhibition in Dublin? Some worker unrest had broken out in Belfast, and the strike of 1907 was a significant precursor to the Dublin 1913 lockout. The main issue of the strike leadership was in union recognition. But in Belfast, it was also complicated by unprecedented unrest with the Royal Irish Constabulary. Although it wasn't the first strike of the year, serious trouble flared in Belfast docks at the end of April, when a number of coal fillers were locked out by their employers at York Dock. And this slide shows some overturned carriages, which we'll come back to later on in a couple of more slides. So the coal fillers were members of James Larkin's National Union of Dock Labourers. James Larkin had come over from England and was trying to set up trade unions within some of these areas. And the Belfast newsletter forecast a general strike of dock workers within days. In this, they were correct. The employees responded to the general walkout by importing labour from non-unionised workers from Liverpool. Again, the connections back and forward between Belfast and Liverpool were very good. There was a mail steamer running back and forward at that time, so it was really easy to connect from Liverpool to Belfast. And that's why people say there's more Irish in Liverpool than there is in other parts of the world, because it was so easy for them to go across. It was late May before the next major escalation took place, and that started to impact on those steamers, affecting the Fleetwood to Heysham services. Some of the carters who were employed by Wordy & Co. and Cowan & Co. were the next people to go on strike, refusing to transport goods to and from the docks. So you can see here in this image, it was the carters that were moving goods by horse and cart. As I said earlier on, Gallagher's ferried nearly 2,000 employees to the show, and really that was suggesting that their staff were being rewarded for their services. Thomas Gallagher, who was chairman of the Belfast Steamship Company, heavily involved with what was happening in the docks. At one stage, the unrest spilled over into his York Street factory because he was also the owner of that particular factory. Ironically, James Larkin had given a union talk in that factory, and some of the workers had organised themselves into a trade union. And as a result of that, 7 of the girls who worked in the factory were dismissed. And this precipitated a walkout of over 1,000 of the employees. And this card here depicts the Cameron Highlanders standing guard at the Gallagher's tobacco factory. So they were brought in very much to defend the premises. So how did we move the goods? As the strike developed, the police escorts were brought in, and they were put in place to help convey those goods from the source to the docks. This card is produced by a guy called J.W. Boyd, and the handwritten note on the back of the card says, "This card is one of the numerous scenes witnessed here daily." So people were using this prior to the telephone of sending messages. At that stage, the post was delivered maybe 3 times a day. So you could send the card out in the morning, somebody could send a reply back in the afternoon, and you could keep that communication going very well, not like today's mail. So as the strike developed, the Carters Association represented the employers and responded to the strike that carters should return to work or they would be locked out. So that was the ultimatum that they were given. The coal merchants then entered the fray and they walked out. That led to a serious shortage of coal, and that soon led to closures amongst the larger industrial operations of the city. For those of us who remember, very similar to what happened in the 1970s, where we had power outages and other things taking place. In response to that, some of the employers started using motor lorries, for want of a better description. And these are steam traction engines, again, with police protection to ferry goods to and from the dock. And again, I was quite interested in this because when I looked at the 1901 census, when I was doing some of my family history research, trying to work out where I came from, way back in 1901, one of my relatives had said his occupation was a carter. And again, after we saw this, the 1911 census, there was very few carters then starting to appear in the census. So we saw that this was a real change in what was taking place. At this time, the dockers had their support. They held mass meetings. They engaged in peaceful picketing, just as we see today with the trade unions, which was permitted under the December 1906 Trade Union and Trade Disputes Act. But there was sporadic illegal action. The blacklegs were stoned, the police escorts were attacked, and unprotected carts were overturned, a bit like those ones that we saw in one of those earlier postcards. So all of these images that I put on the screen all come from the postcards that were produced at that time as a way of telling the message and telling the story of what was going on. We started to refer to the steam engines. You see this one here is slightly different. It doesn't have the big steam engine at the front, doesn't have the big wheels. It's starting to look a bit more like a modern motor vehicle with smaller wheels and an engine and a driver. So the employers, they brought in non-union workers to drive the vehicles in an attempt to beat the strikes. They were often attacked by mobs, and again, they were overturned or scattered over the road, and this necessitated more police protection. This was probably one of the reasons why the traction engines were used, because it's a bit more difficult to overturn a big heavy traction engine than it was to overturn a cart. The image here is produced by a firm called Walton, and they were based at Royal Avenue, and I didn't knock the building down whenever we built Castle Court, Brett. I think somebody else did that, but that's roughly where they were based. You can see here that the engine says L and Y and L and NW Railway, which is most likely the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway. And they also ran the steamboat services across the Irish Sea and North Sea. And they were a big ship owner, as well as a railway company. It was amalgamated into the London and North West Railway on the 1st of January 1922. And again, of note, already by 1907, you can see that both emblems were appearing on the front of this engine. So obviously way back in that time, even prior to 1922, there was obviously a working relationship between those. So what happened after that? This slide here is a second one produced by Walton. You can just see the Walton name in the bottom corner. And this shows another train of motor vehicles under police escort. Although it was produced by Walton, you can just see here a little name in the bottom of the picture. And again, that is Bird from Belfast, W.G. Bird. So again, Bird did a lot of photographs. There's a lot of those recorded throughout the years. So even though Walton produced the postcard, the picture seems to have been taken by Bird. And again, if you look closely at some of these images, you can start to glean a little bit of the history. One of the difficulties with postcards in those days is nobody kept a record of how many cards were produced. So you knew there was a set of images that came out, but you didn't know, was it 4 images, was it 6, was it 12, was it 16? And it's quite difficult when you're collecting these to know just how many images were produced by each of the different groups. So Brett outlined some of my experience as a civil engineer. For me, I believe this was the catalyst for the change in how goods were transported in the north of Ireland at this time, because prior to this, it was all horse and cart. And after this, we saw the major change in motor vehicles. So for me, that strike, that dispute was really a catalyst in how things started to change as to how we started to move around. Fast forward that just after World War II, there were 55,000 vehicles registered in Northern Ireland. By the 1960s, people were starting to talk about congestion. And if any of you ever remember the Malibu advert where they had a congestion in Jamaica where there was a 1 car and 2 sheep behind, and they talked about, congestion. The 1960s, that's what it was like. There was a 1-minute delay driving through the city, so they started building the motorways. Fast forward 70 years ahead, 2022, there were 1.1 million private vehicles registered in Northern Ireland. And yet, from the 1960s to today, we're still using that same infrastructure. So you can see how the catalyst of introducing the private vehicles has changed our history and changed our transport network. Moving forward, relieving the guard. We talked about the guard at Gallagher's. We talked about the guard coming forward. What they found at this stage was that the police response was not a direct response to the strike, but rather across the long-stand grievances over the absence of a pay rise for 20 years. So if you said to anybody today, you're not getting a pay rise for 20 years, you could see why the trade unions were starting to form. You could see why things were starting to get a little bit more hostile. And the civil authorities were alarmed by these developments, and they rushed troops into Belfast, amongst which was the Cameron Highlanders and attachments from the Royal Sussex, the Royal Berkshire, and the Middlesex regiments. The Irish Times claimed that as many as 4,000 troops were sent in 1907. One of the cards presented here has the message on the back. Just after noon on Saturday, August the 10th, serious rioting broke out when 3 flour vans going to the quays were attacked as they left the mill on Divis Street. The military reinforcements managed to bring the situation under control. So that was a live report sent out on one of these cards. So they were obviously being produced very quickly and getting them out into society. And one of the advantages of getting them used is the postmark can give you the date. So a lot of these have been used in 1907, around that time. What did they bring with them? So with the military arriving in Belfast, it was clear that they were prepared for action. And this card depicts a Maxim gun with a section of the Middlesex Regiment. And they were actually based in Ormeau Park, as it says at the bottom of this card. So again, the little titles, the images, they start to help you piece together the story of what was happening. As well as the military, police reinforcements were also recruited in what they call Derry and Louth to come to Belfast, while those officers of dubious loyalty were transferred out of Belfast to other places. This image here on the back, it tells me it was produced by J.W. Boyd, who was based at 44 to 46 North Street. Again, just around the corner from Castle Court, but again, not very far from the docks. So you can see how they were starting to record the images that were taking place. What else can we glean from the postcards? The troops were based at Ormeau Park. That then was on the edge of Belfast City. It was just across the river. It's the oldest municipal park in Belfast, and it was officially opened to the public in 1871. If my memory is correct, those of you who are experts might know better. When Botanic Gardens opened, you had to pay to go into Botanic Gardens, whereas Ormeau Park was free. So there was a bit of difference there. It became more accessible to the general public, but it was so big that at that time the troops were based in there. What happened? Just like modern troubles, it escalated. Sunday, August the 11th, it very much centred on Leeson Street and spread onto the Springfield Road and Grosvenor Road in Belfast, leaving many seriously injured. Trouble continued in the Wider Falls area, and on the 12th of August, it resulted in the shooting dead of 2 Conway Street residents, one called Charles McMullen and one referred to as Maggie Lennon. And I think here in one of these, one of the very rare cards that I have, which isn't on the slide, is this young picture here of Charles McMullen. Somebody actually produced a picture of him as a commemoration card on that incident. So again, I'll put that on the table later on. The strike leaders and the local clergy made efforts to restore peace. And this was seen as jolting the strikers and employers to seek an immediate settlement. It's a bit like the Enniskillen bomb in the more recent times. It really focused the mind as to what was happening. And we saw that taking place after this. There was a partial return to work by the carters by the end of the week, and others followed the next week. Again, that's another J.W. Boyd. You can just see it down on the bottom. And that was postally used. Again, the postmark's dated the 21st of August, 1907. So again, we're getting this real time. Cards being produced locally very quickly and sold out, and people using them to send out the message. And that was not long after the death of the 2 victims, which were seen here passing Dundle Park on the Falls Road. This is Leeson Street. So Boyd also issued a card depicting the second funeral of the victims at Leeson Street. The card, once again, shows the image produced by Bird in Belfast. And looking at this, when you look at the amount of people that were there, I believe that this was a real catalyst for the changes that happened around 1907. So I'm not going to dwell anymore on the Belfast strike. I've never managed to find out. I believe there's about 24 cards exist of the Belfast strike. I have some of them here. I have some others that I didn't produce. I think there's another 1 or 2 that still exist that I haven't seen, and I'm trying to find those. I regularly go to auctions around the UK and Ireland. I regularly go to flea markets. Even in New York, I was searching through boxes of stuff to see what I can find, because you never know where you might find these. And again, they were produced in very small numbers, so it's very difficult to get a hold of them. So I believe I have another 2 to find. Let's move on to Home Rule, because that's the next major incident that took place in the history. And there's lots of postcards produced with lots of people on them over this period. And really, just to connect the story and bring it a little bit further, you're very aware there's been 3 Home Rule bills. Attempts led mainly by the Dublin Protestants seeking more autonomy for their decisions in Ireland. The first 2 were rejected. And then this brings us up to 1909. And a crisis really started to erupt between the House of Lords and the House of Commons, each of which accused the other of breaking historic conventions. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, he's not on those 2, he's in the box here somewhere, hoping to clear the way for an onslaught on the Lords' veto on legislation. He framed his budget so that the House of Lords were likely to reject it. So there was lots of politics going on with the different parties. After the Lords, hoping to force a general election, rejected the Finance Bill in November 1909, the Commons accused the Lords of breaking the convention of not rejecting a budget, because he wanted it rejected to call an election. So he said, you've broken the convention. And then the Prime Minister, which was Asquith, appealed to the country. And again, that was an important step in the process of Home Rule. While the Liberal government and its Conservative and Unionist oppositions were equally matched in the House of Commons, Redmond had the support of more than 80 Irish MPs, thereby granting the House of Commons majority for the bill if he had partnered up. The strong but ultimately ineffective opposition of the bill in Parliament from both the Conservative and Unionist politicians was predictable. On the right here, you see Joseph Chamberlain, who at that time was a British statesman. He was he was a radical liberal, and after opposing the Home Rule for Ireland, he became a liberal unionist, and eventually served as a leading imperialist in coalition with the Conservatives. So you can see, a bit like today, DUP are siding with one party, Sinn Féin is siding with another, SDLP are siding with others. There was lots of politics going on at that time where they were trying to force things through. So Chamberlain at that time, he was believed to have split both major parties during his career. Now, who was he? He was actually the father by different marriages of the Nobel Peace winner Austen Chamberlain, and also father of the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who came after him. We were getting some cartoon cards starting to appear at this time. This is a Redmond cartoon. There was a general election in 1910, and it left the Liberals and Conservatives again equally matched, a bit like now when we go to Stormont, we have elections and we always end up with the same hung parliament, for want of a better description, with equal votes on both sides. Redmond's Irish nationalists were then holding the balance of power in the House of Commons. The price of their support was to pass the budget through the Commons, and it was a measure to curb the power of the House of Lords at that time, and that was seen as the last obstacle of the Home Rule Act. After the Lords rejected that measure, a second general election took place in December 1910, and it left again the Houses of Commons arithmetically barely changed. So again, another election, no change. If the Liberals had been able to defeat the House of Lords, they would need the support of the Irish Party, and that's why the Home Rule Bill was put forward. So again, lots of cards were produced. I see there's one or two in the back cabinet that have been brought out. And some of the cards, you can see the different sides in this. Some of the cards on the left at this time tried to paint a nice romantic, happy picture of Ireland under Home Rule. You can see a ruined monastery sitting there at the side in splendour. A nice placid sea, a lovely bathed Celtic sunset, and a young lad carrying his Home Rule placard stand with his dog in peaceful, idyllic surroundings. You know, if only it was so true. You could forgive the view that that young man has been contended as an Irish leprechaun, because the dress that he has there would not be out of place on a stage set at that time. So very much that was set out to try and sell that. On the right, you see something completely different. Again, bear in mind, this was around about 1910, before the border was put in place, and you can already see some of the images portraying Ireland with this bit of green and a bit of Union Jack. The anti-Home Rule cards, there was again others coming through, and again you can see the clever propaganda starting to talk about Ulster's appeal. This figure here on the right is called Scotland. There's a little red hand here, so you can see the issues that were again. Sam was one of these out in the back in the cabinet as well. The other one on the right, you can see Ulster's prayer, don't let go, trying to pull things across, and ironically, the card shows the 4 provinces: Ulster, Munster, Connacht, and the other one whose name I can't remember off the top of my head at the minute. So that's just, there was lots of these cards coming out at that time, and they were being posted back and forward with messages on it. Again, on the right, association of Home Rule with militant trade unionism had a maximum effect on employers. A series of strikes took place in 1907. There was violent repercussions taking place in Britain at that time. There was a new alliance of trade unions, and they were trying to paralyse the country in the future disputes. The linking of Home Rule to this sort of activity was to strike terror into employers. And again, this is a very clever piece of propaganda which encapsulated many unionist objections to Home Rule. The card on the right is published by a guy called Adams, J. Adams, from New King Street. I never found out where New King Street is in Belfast, and that's an image of Colonel Wallace. And the message underneath, we won't have Home Rule, and Ulster will fight, and Ulster will be right. I know there's a local guy who's written 2 books about that over the last decade. Who Wallace, as he was called? He was really a British soldier and a lawyer and politician. And he was born in Downpatrick in County Down, so he's very much a local Northern Ireland man. Having failed to defeat the Home Rule Bill measure by parliamentary means, the Ulster Unionists resorted to non-parliamentary methods and the start of mass gatherings and parades. And part of this was extensive Unionist publicity campaign, much of it decided through these political postcards. And the one on the left, again, I see is in the cabinet at the back, very much showing their Carson on the front and an orange parade coming through there. So these were being circulated around, putting that image out into the public so that everybody could see what was happening. And really it was being sent out to try and galvanise supporters on this particular side. There was a whole range of different types of cards used. The political rallies, the marches, the artists' impressions of events taking place, the pictures of gun running from 1914, the political cartoons, the poor political verse from both sides. And again, I brought a few examples of those along tonight as well. But some of these are my favourites. Some of the very clever propaganda was really playing on Protestant fears of Catholicism, and it encapsulated many Unionist objections to Home Rule. So maybe take just a minute or two and explain what we have in these pictures. So on the left, we've got Donegal Place under Home Rule. I'm putting forward some examples. The one on the left is probably the one that's most best known. Again, produced by Bird in Belfast on the right. It dates back to the 1912-1914 campaign. It's done by an anonymous cartoonist, and he's envisaging the plight of Belfast under Home Rule Parliament. So City Hall at the stage was only completed in 1906. On that site was the White Linen Hall before that. So this was a fairly modern building in 1912. It was only 6 years old. If you look at the top, it's got an Irish harp flag, not a tricolour, because the tricolour wasn't invented at that stage. It was an Irish harp flag. The building's lying derelict. There's a workhouse overshadowing everything on the right-hand side. The Robinson Cleaver store, which was around at that time, is a lovely to let sign on the left-hand side. There's farm animals grazing in the heart of the city. And again, all trying to put fear into it. There's a statue of Redmond in the middle, unlike the statue of Victoria that actually stands there. Again, the one on the right, the fears are expressed at Carrickfergus Castle. And again, according to the artist, the castle is ruined. There's a sunken boat, just like the sunken boat at the front. Again, there's a statue of John Redmond. And if you go down there today, there's actually a statue of King Billy. But that's been replaced by John Redmond. The graffiti artist expresses his own political views with the irreverent version of the Latin inscription on the plinth, which says, Redmond Rex Hibernia. Carrickfergus at that stage was quite sober, and it's now defied with the harbour bar, and instead of the word proprietor, it actually says proper rioter. So again, there's plays on words by this artist. And there's, again, the nationalist MP, Joe Devlin, is named there. Unionists will know that Carrickfergus was the landing place of William of Orange. So this was a very provocative image being sent out at that stage, published by a firm called Valentine's. Valentine's produced lots of cards after this period. There was a third image in this series, which was the Albert Clock. That was completed in 1869 to commemorate the visit of Queen Victoria and Albert coming to Belfast. Royal Avenue got its name from that visit. And I believe that when you go down Royal Avenue, you see a lovely facade of buildings, some of which are 4 stories. But when you turn the corner, some of them are only half a room thick on the upper floors, because there was a rush to finish Royal Avenue for that particular royal visit. But one of the things that was built then was the Albert Clock in 1869. It's one of Belfast's best known landmarks. One of the memories that I have of that is the first Irish man to climb Mount Everest was Dawson Stelfox, who was the conservation architect who did the remedial work. And there's a lovely picture of Dawson climbing up the outside of the Albert Clock as he was doing the surveying of that. Dorans, a local engineering firm, corrected the lean. It's got a 1.2 metre lean, and the City Council, a bit like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, they asked for the lean to remain when they stabilised the foundations of that about 20 years ago. But again, this image here of Albert Clock is quite important. You can see its destruction. It's making way for the statue, another statue of John Redmond coming in on the trolley. The Custom House has its steps in the background. The steps, as the people will know, it was the Speaker's Corner in Belfast at those steps. So a lot of street preachers would have made their way to it. There's a little tavern called Molly Maguire's. Now, Molly Maguire's was the name given to a secret society whose members attacked mainly Protestant landlords. So again, you can see here that very much an attack on what was likely to happen. Poverty is shown as rife. You can see here lots of people have no choice but to queue up at the immigration office, which offers, in the sign that you just can't see here, tickets for New York or anywhere. And time is short because you can see the ship sitting in the docks with the American Stars and Stripes flag at that, which was very reminiscent of what was happening after the famine. Lots of people traveling to America. That's another card that was produced by Bird, and that one dates back to 1912. And again, other images there. You can lead a horse to water, but that again brought into Home Rule. So the whole series of those came forward with propaganda at that time. So we talked about what was happening at that time. Ulster Covenant was a key feature then. As we can see from these images, a bit like today, where things are very similar. Unionists in Ulster have a fear, Brexit have a fear that is pulling Northern Ireland away from Great Britain. And exactly the same thing happened in 1912 with that approval of the Home Rule Bill. And that was seen as another point of violence taking place on this island. Early in 1912, the Ulster Unionist leader, Sir Edward Carson, could review 100,000 marching Ulster volunteers. And these images here, excuse me, were produced by Walton Publishers. And these are both showing images of what was happening at the King's Hall at the Balmoral Showgrounds. So you can see there, the postcards have given us a very clear history of the images that were taking place at that stage in 1912. I'll move on to a couple more about the Ulster Covenant. So the Covenant was debated at the Ulster Hall. There's a table, a nice round table that has been recorded, which still exists, which is the round table that the image on the right has with the Union flag draped over it. So it was debated by the Unionists, and it was finally drawn up by Carson and organised by Sir James Craig. James Craig, we know, was a prominent Unionist politician. He was the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party and the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. The Covenant specifically pledged not to acknowledge any Parliament out of Dublin, nor to obey its laws, nor pay any taxes placed under its government. And this would be problematic, especially since Ulster was the wealthiest and most prosperous part of Ireland at that time. So a lot of the other people on the island were very nervous that this was causing partition, which we know it actually did. The Walton card on the right depicts Sir Edward Carson as the first person to sign the Covenant on 28th of September. Beside him is Lord Londonderry, Charles Stewart, Tempest Stewart, the 6th Marquess of Derry, and the former Viceroy of Ireland. And to the right shoulder of Carson is Sir James Craig, and that's the three prominent people that were involved in that. For me, Charles Tempest Stewart, one of his descendants was Lady Mary Berry, who owned Mount Stewart. And I had the very honour and privilege of Lady Mary Berry nominating me to join the Royal Philatelic Society in London. So I think I was one of two people at that stage in Ireland who were invited to join the Royal Philatelic Society, where the Queen comes along to do presentations at the time. So that's my link with that particular slide through Lady Mary. And there's a whole other story of that for another day. I talked about the Redmond statue replacing Victoria. So this is another picture from that time in 1912 in September, looking back from the Queen Victoria Station statue back down Royal Avenue. And at that stage, nearly 500,000 people were out protesting against that third Home Rule Bill. And today, that date of the 28th of September is known as Ulster Day. These are different cards. These were produced by a firm called Hearst & Co., who had a fine art warehouse based in Belfast. And again, you can see how they have recorded what was taking place at that time in 1912. So, coming back to the politics of what was happening at that stage, the Ulster Unionists were determined to prevent any measure of Home Rule taking place. And around this time, we see cards like this starting to appear. And again, these were produced by Bird in Belfast. One of them is actually a Christmas card, and the other is just a propaganda postcard. So again, way back in 1912, they were using the availability of all means to try and get their message across as to what was taking place. But at that stage, this was the formation of the Ulster Volunteer Force. They were starting to come up. And what we find here, this image on the bottom left, is a boat called the Mountjoy. And this was one of the images that were taken for the gun running. There was a major gun running smuggling operation taking place in April 1914 in Ireland, and it was organised by Major Crawford and Captain Spender for the Ulster Unionists to equip them with the weapons for the UVF. The operation involved smuggling of about 25,000 rifles and between 3 and 5 million rounds of ammunition. Where did that come from? Bear in mind what was happening around this period, around 1914 in the world. It was actually coming from the Germans. And ships like this landed in Larne, Donaghadee and Bangor in the early hours between Friday the 24th and Saturday the 25th of April. The gun running really made history because we believe that this is the first time in history that motor vehicles were being used on a large scale for military purposes, and with striking success because actually they were able to transport all of that through a motor cavalcade. And in the glass cabinet at the back, there's another image, very like this one, which actually shows that motor cavalcade coming, I think it's either from Bangor or Larne, I can't remember which image it was. Now, that was taking place in the north half of the island. In Dublin, the Irish volunteers were doing exactly the same thing, and they were smuggling munitions in through Dublin. And the British Army attempted to stop them, and at one stage they actually fired into a crowd of civilians. And that then, a bit like Bloody Sunday, led to a massive issue of starting to have protests and violence taking place. So by 1914, Ireland was really on the brink of civil war at that stage, and we've been very lucky that a lot of those images have been recorded in these postcards. The image on the right is really there as a reminder for me that in 1914, we had World War I taking place. And we had Ireland's involvement in that. So you can see as well as that there are cards being issued at that stage to commemorate what's happening with the war. Ironically, the Dublin guys were also importing arms in from the Germans. This is really interesting. What else was happening at that stage that's recorded in the cards? Some of these cards are what we call real photograph cards. So the one on the left it's a real photograph that's been made into a postcard. So some of the photographers in Belfast were producing images like this, making them into postcards and producing them in a very, very small number. So it wasn't just the arming of volunteers that was happening at that time. The UVS had set up a number of different organisations that were seen as essential to their needs at this time. And again, over 100 years ago, this enigmatic group of women came together to form the Ulster Volunteer Force Medical and Nursing Corps. And they were trained as Red Cross nurses and sought to see their training to form a nursing corps attached to the Ulster Volunteer Force. And again, that was the way for those women to show their loyalty to the Crown at that stage. The card to the right is really interesting. That's another image taken at Balmoral at King's Hall. And you can't see the title, but I'll read it out to you. And it actually says, UVF Flying Squad at Balmoral, 27th of September 1913. So we know that Balmoral developed as a bit of had planes landing at it at one stage. The significance of all the bicycles, I don't know, but they actually called this their flying squad. And again, that's produced by a card from Hearst & Co. as well, based in Belfast. So I love when I find these because you can start to get bits of the history coming together. Fast forward a couple of years, what happened? We're all very familiar with the 1916 Rising story. We all know of the culmination of the Troubles taking place in Dublin at that time. The Irish Volunteers at that stage took over the General Post Office in Sackville Street in Dublin. Why the General Post Office? Because it was the symbol of the Crown in Ireland at the time. That was based in a place called Sackville Street. We now know that as O'Connell Street because it was renamed by the Irish government a number of years after that. A number of these images exist. These are independently produced postcards. There's no details where they were printed. There's no details of who printed them. And bear in mind that after the 1916 events, government was trying to censor lots of stuff, so people weren't putting their name on some of these images. And you can see there the devastation that's taking place. Reminds us a little bit of the images that we're seeing from Ukraine. The one on the right is at the side of Abbey Street, showing the ruins of some of the buildings. So even though it was only a 6-day event, you can see the damage that took place on that. Some of the real photographic cards that were produced by a firm called Rotary Press. They produced lots of images for newspapers. They printed real photographic cards. I remember developing pictures in the past, and you were using a fixer at the end to try and fix the image. I believe the fix on some of these cards wasn't great because I've never seen one of really sharp quality. After 100 years, they've all deteriorated, and that's why some of these images are a little bit poor. This one here, I have been able to understand that they actually numbered them. So 6719-11, there was a series of 6 of these images were produced for the Easter Rising. They're again, because of the politics, there's a little note on them to say printed in Britain, and a little note down there saying Rotary photo on the right-hand side. We actually know that they were printed in Belfast, but again, nobody wanted to put their name onto them because of the political consequences of that. There's a general view there showing a ruined restaurant on the left, and on the right we have the ruins views from O'Connell. There was a lot of political backlash on this because on the bottom it actually says the Sinn Féin revolt in Dublin. And a bit like today, Sinn Féin said we are not an armed organisation, it wasn't us. So there was a bit of protest about the use of the word Sinn Féin on that. And they took offence to the Sinn Féin rebellion. The next slide, I've shown an image there of the other 4, and you can see the 2 bottom ones where the images have deteriorated. And I've bought a number of these, and they're all exactly the same. These basically show what was called the Metropole Hotel, the post office, and Nelson Column, the ruins of Liberty Hall, and the interior of the main sorting room in the post office, and the general view of the devastated city. So when you see that one, this is the post office one here, which is just in ruins. There's a whole other story and a whole other study as to what happened with the postal system in Dublin at that time, how the machines were doing, how the mail was cancelled. And it's a very interesting story, which is one for another day, and how the stamps were produced and how all of this was sorted. Another major contributor to this period was a group called the Powell Press, who were also printers. They were based at 22 Parliament Street in Dublin. And in May, they issued a series of machine-printed cards commemorating the Irish Republican leaders from the Rising. Initially, I thought that there were 28 of the cards because there's a number of publications. There's a couple of records that show the 28 cards, and it took me 20 years to find the 28 cards. And Brett referred to my silver medal. I did do a presentation to the Dublin Philatelic Society last year and was awarded the silver medal for that. And the 28 cards fitted very nicely into what we call a one-frame display. And because that was there to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the formation of Northern Ireland, that they wanted images and information relating to that period. So I was invited to display that at that particular exhibition. And when I was there was a gentleman said to me, "You've got 28? I said, "Yeah." He said, "I've got 28. And I said, "So we know there's 28 cards." And he went, "You've got 2 that I don't have, and I've got 2 that you don't have." So after a bit more work and the transfer of some funds, I managed to purchase a couple of them, and we have subsequently found another 2. So we know that there's 36 of these images now that we've pulled together. But again, they were produced in such small numbers. Some of them, the likes of these ones, are quite popular. You can pick them up. We know there's a couple of hundred of them exist. But others, the other 4 that I've missed, I've only ever seen one copy in 30 years come up anywhere at exhibitions, auctions, anywhere. So I've been lucky enough to purchase them to put them into the collection. I brought along a selection of these tonight, but looking at the time, I don't want to talk about them. I'll put them on the table. You can have a look at them and see. But there were a number of different types of these, and they were really there as commemoration cards. I'm not going to go through and talk about them because Brett, I'm very conscious of the time. I don't want to be dwelling on that. But to talk about a couple, these ovals, there's a couple of people in uniform. So we've got Edward Daly on the left, and we've got a chap called Eamon de Valera that we'll have heard of on the right. The de Valera one is quite interesting because a lot of these cards are there to commemorate people who were executed after the Rising. They were put into jail at Kilmainham jail, and they were executed afterwards. Now, the one on the right, Eamon de Valera, he was actually born George de Valero in October 1882, and he changed his name around about 1901 to Edward de Valera. And he was he commanded the forces at Boland's Mill on Grand Canal Street in Dublin, and he was caught, he was sent to jail, he was sentenced to death, but he was born in New York City, and the new government didn't want to have friction with the Americans, so he was actually spared the execution and put into an internment camp instead. So he's one of only a few people who actually survived the ruling to be executed. Equality, diversity, and inclusion. There were 2 women appeared on that series of 32 cards. One called Mrs. Joseph Plunkett, who was actually Grace Gifford. And she's interesting because her husband, Joseph Mary Plunkett, is the only person to appear on 2 different cards. There's an image of him standing and another one with his bust. And he married Grace 7 hours before he was executed with the firing squad at the age of 28 in Kilmainham jail. And his sweetheart Grace was a Protestant convert to Catholicism. Her sister Muriel had married their best friend, who was Thomas MacDonagh, who was also shot for his role in the Easter Rising. So there was a family connection there. The other female that was Countess Markovich, and again, she was also arrested and sentenced to death. But to use the words of the court, she was she was sentenced to death, but the court recommended mercy solely and only on the account of her sex. So one advantage of being female at that stage was she was spared the execution. She went on to become the first female to be elected as an MP after that. What happened to these people who were interned? Little place called Frongoch in North Wales was a lot of the prisoners were sent there. It was originally a German prisoner of war camp. So they moved the prisoners out, and they moved a lot. There was 1,800 Irish prisoners rounded up and sent to Frongoch. And that included people like Michael Collins. Now, that camp became a seeding ground for the spread of Irish rebels. And you had people like Michael Collins doing lessons in guerrilla warfare away back in 1916. Some people describe it as the University of the Revolution because you had 1,800 nationalists rounded up in one place with leaders who were there effectively training them to come forward and do what they needed to do. Also at that time, there was another camp down where the mountains of Mourne sweep down to the sea at Ballykinler, which was previously also a German prisoner of war camp. Later became an army camp, which survived right up until recent times. And there was a question put in by Captain Ben in Hansard on the 16th of June 1921. And if I quote, 31 members of Parliament have been interned as being persons suspected of acting or having acted in a manner prejudicial to the restoration of order in Ireland. These include members of the Imperial Parliament and the Parliaments for Southern and Northern Ireland. So as late as 1921, there were still 31 elected representatives had been rounded up and were interned in this camp in Ballykinler. Ironically, they also called it the university. Those little wooden huts, if you look at those, there's one of those has been rebuilt in Down County Down Jail. It's now open to the public, and it tells the story of the German prisoners of war and the army subsequently, and the life of some of those huts at Ballykinler. Well worth a visit if you haven't seen that. So that's really bringing me up. I want to just conclude, Brett, with a couple of 1970s, 1980 postcards. The postcards didn't stop. The different groups were still producing propaganda postcards at this stage. Um, the one on the left, modern fractions of paramilitaries being producing them. That's an image of Bobby Sands after he died on hunger strike on the 5th of May 1981. And again, another propaganda card showing what happened at his funeral as he was buried at a Republican plot. 1974, again, more images at that stage. This one produced by a group called the Dryuda Press, if I can pronounce that right. And they show an example of what we call the third series of Sinn Féin propaganda cards. We've been able to put these into series for each year that they were published. And the one on the left is 2010, showing some of the murals at the Bogside. I remember when I was up there, one of those was actually now an image of the Dairy Girls, which has subsequently been moved to Boyleside Shopping Centre because it's so popular. But you can see the crudeness of some of these as to how they were produced. One of the jobs that I did for Brett way back about 11 years ago was to go in and look at the Maze prison before it was demolished. So again, it has a little bit of resonance for me. But you can see this from the nationalist side, what they were doing. But it wasn't just the nationalist side. The loyalist movements were producing lots of murals, and they produced lots of postcards. I think there's at least 9 series of these over 9 different years. And they started publishing these in the late 1990s. The one on the left shows the Ulster Freedom Fighters, or UEFF, and the one on the right also referring to the Maze and the H Block, showing Freedom 2000 from the loyalist side whenever the prisoners were released in 2000. And that's located in the Shankill Road and commemorates that release in 2000. Another one, if there's any really heavy metal fans, there is an image there of what they called Eddie from one of the Iron Maiden albums. And he's shown there as we were not sure if it's a UFF or a UDA campaigner rampaging through Londonderry, killing Jacobite soldiers from the 1690. You can just see on the bottom right the modern day mural of Free Derry Corner, as it's called. There's a petrol bomb there shrouded in the background of what's happening. The one on the right is another mural that was taking place on the Shankill Road, and it says Shankill Road supports Drumkey. And we know 95, 96, 97 was a very turmoil time here. And again, you can see these propaganda postcards were being produced. I remember trying to drive home in 1995 after that and actually getting my car attacked. And people surrounding it and banging on it, and I just had to put it in reverse and drive straight back out again. But you can see how they were using these images to do that. My final slide, Brett will be glad to hear, is a lady called Christine Spengler. So people tapped in on this. And Christine Spengler, she was born in 1945. She's a French war photographer. And in the 1970s, she spent a lot of time photographing people in Derry, Londonderry, Belfast, and the conflicts. She worked for an organisation called the Nylon magazine, and she photographed a lot of protests in Northern Ireland. But her pictures characteristically always seemed to have children in them. She was there trying to just make some money out of what was happening and taking place. So look, that's a very whistle-stop tour. Another propaganda card on the right. What's happening down around, originating from Armagh. As I said earlier on, thank you for allowing me to share my passion for political postcards. I could talk all night about some of the images on these. They're very much my own personal views. It's following a long period of study. For example, I'm going to Bala in North Wales to try and find any remnants of the camp. And I have other visits taking place over the next year trying to glean more information and to try and find if I can find anything. So what I want to do is say thank you for allowing me to present to you tonight. And sorry if I've overrun a little bit.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you very much indeed for a remarkable.